It began with a single painting. A haunting image, its colors muted and dark, depicting a sorrowful child standing in the rain. His hollow eyes seemed to follow anyone who looked at it. Some swore the painting moved when they weren't watching. The first recorded owner was Richard Halston, an antique dealer from New York. He found the piece at a small estate sale, its origins unknown. Drawn to its eerie beauty, he purchased it without hesitation. Within a week, Richard began noticing strange occurrences. At night, he'd hear faint whispers echoing through his apartment, muffled, childlike sobs. The lights flickered erratically, and objects moved on their own. Then came the nightmares. Every night, Richard dreamed of drowning in endless rain, his body growing colder, weaker, as unseen hands pulled him beneath the surface. He'd wake up gasping, soaked in sweat, only to find wet footprints trailing from the painting to his bed. Terrified, he tried to sell it. No one would take it. Buyers who expressed interest would suddenly fall ill before completing the purchase. A gallery owner who agreed to display it suffered a stroke the night before the exhibit. Desperate, Richard burned the painting in his backyard. It should have ended there. But the next morning, when he entered his living room, the painting was hanging on the wall, untouched. And the child in the painting was no longer standing in the rain. He was inside the house. Richard's screams were never heard. The police found his body 3 days later, drowned, inside his own apartment, with no source of water nearby. The painting? Gone. But it would return. And its curse was only beginning. The painting resurfaced 2 years later. It was found at an art auction in Boston, mistakenly labeled as an unclaimed antique. No record existed of how it got there. That night, renowned collector Margaret Langley placed the winning bid. She was drawn to the painting's unsettling aura. Something about the sorrow in the child's eyes spoke to her. The moment it entered her home, things changed. At first, it was subtle. The air in her gallery grew heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth. The temperature in the room where the painting hung dropped, no matter how high the thermostat was set. Then came the shadows. Margaret would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, dark figures lurking just beyond her vision. One night, she heard a faint drip, 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 echoing through the hallway. There were no leaks. Yet, by morning, her expensive Persian rug was soaked with muddy water, forming a trail leading straight to the painting. The child's expression had changed. His lips were parted slightly, as if whispering. His eyes, once sorrowful, were now filled with something far worse. Hunger. Margaret's fear turned into obsession. She locked the painting in her basement, covering it with a cloth. But even unseen, it watched. She felt its presence pressing against her mind, invading her thoughts. On the 5th night, her security cameras captured something horrifying. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the painting moved. The canvas rippled as if something inside was trying to escape. The outline of small hands pressed against the fabric, stretching the surface. Then, a child's laughter echoed through the house. The next morning, Margaret called an art historian to have the painting removed. But before he could arrive, she vanished. Her mansion was found empty, doors wide open, a trail of wet footprints leading from her bedroom to the basement. The painting? Still there. The child in the painting had moved again. Now, he was smiling. The painting was confiscated from Margaret Langley's abandoned mansion and placed in a secure vault at the Boston Art Museum. For months, it remained untouched, until an ambitious auctioneer named Daniel Reeves decided to investigate its origins. Daniel had heard rumors about the painting, but he dismissed them as superstition. He was a man of logic, driven by wealth, not folklore. He believed there had to be an explanation for the strange events surrounding it. So, one evening, he retrieved the painting from storage and examined it under bright museum lights. That's when he noticed something chilling. Under the layers of cracked oil paint, barely visible in the dim glow, was a name. Not the artist's name. A child's name. Jonas Caldwell. Curious, Daniel searched old records and uncovered a disturbing truth. Jonas Caldwell was a missing boy from the 1920s, one of 6 children who had vanished in a small Pennsylvania town. Their bodies were never found. The only clue left behind? A series of paintings, each depicting a different child, each one rumored to bring misfortune to its owner. Daniel's hands trembled as he looked at the painting again. The boy's expression had shifted once more. His lips curled upward, as if he knew Daniel had uncovered his secret. That night, Daniel woke to a scratching sound. Soft at first, then more frantic. It was coming from inside the museum vault. The security footage from that night would never be released to the public, but one guard who saw it described the horror in whispered tones. The painting, it didn't just move. The child inside, he tried to come out. Daniel resigned the next morning, refusing to speak of what he had seen. He made one final request before disappearing into obscurity. Burn it. Burn the painting before it's too late. But the museum never did. Instead, they sold it. And its new owner would soon regret it. After Daniel Reeves resigned, the museum discreetly sold the painting to a private collector, one who specifically sought cursed artifacts. His name was Vincent Harrow, a wealthy recluse with a fascination for the paranormal. His mansion was a fortress of dark history, filled with haunted relics, forbidden books, and objects tied to unsolved mysteries. But Vincent was not afraid. He believed the painting stories were exaggerated, a mere fabrication of overactive imaginations. So, when the crate arrived, he unboxed the painting with steady hands, hung it in his study, and admired its eerie beauty. "You will not haunt me," he whispered. That night, the first incident occurred. At exactly 3:07 a.m., Vincent awoke to the sound of weeping. Soft, muffled, as if a child was crying from inside the walls. He turned on the lights. The room was empty, except for the painting. The boy's expression had changed. His once neutral face now twisted in sorrow, a single tear painted just beneath his left eye. Vincent stared, his heart pounding. Perhaps it was a trick of his mind, a detail he had overlooked before. But the next night, the weeping returned. And the night after that, it grew louder. By the fifth night, it wasn't crying anymore. It was whispering. Vincent recorded the sounds, playing them back in slow motion. What he heard sent chills through his bones. A child's voice, repeating a single phrase over and over. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." Vincent tried to rationalize it. He checked the walls for hidden speakers. He researched voice phenomena. But the truth was undeniable. The painting was not just cursed. It was trapped. And something inside it wanted to be free. Vincent Harrow was not a man who scared easily. He had spent his life collecting the most infamous haunted artifacts known to exist. But this painting was different. After recording the eerie whispers, Vincent took drastic measures. He sealed the painting in a steel-reinforced case, placed it in a locked room, and installed motion sensors. If anything moved, he would know. That night, he barely slept. At 3:07 a.m., the alarms blared. He rushed to his study, gun in hand. The steel-reinforced case had burst open from the inside. The painting lay face down on the floor. The frame had deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Vincent's breath hitched. He slowly turned the painting over. The boy's face had changed again. His tear-streaked face was now filled with rage, his eyes burning a deep, unnatural black. Then, the lights cut out. Total darkness. And in that suffocating silence, Vincent heard it. Footsteps. Not outside. Not in the hallway. But inside the room. Right next to him. Vincent bolted for the door. He yanked it open, sprinted down the hall, and slammed himself into his panic room, locking the door behind him. He turned on the security cameras. The study was empty, but the painting was now hanging back on the wall, perfectly centered. Vincent's hands shook as he stared at the screen. For the first time in his life, he regretted bringing something into his home. The painting wasn't cursed. It was possessed. And whatever lived inside it was getting stronger. Vincent didn't sleep. He stayed in the panic room, monitoring the security feed, heart pounding in his chest. The painting had moved by itself. That much was undeniable. But the real horror was the boy's eyes. They were no longer fixed within the frame. They were looking directly at the camera. Vincent felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just a painting. It was watching him. Then, something even worse happened. The camera feed glitched, flickering between static and an image of the room. And in one of those flickers, the boy was no longer in the painting. Vincent's breath caught. Another flicker. The boy was standing in the middle of the room, his head tilted, his hollow black eyes staring straight into the lens. Then, the feed cut to black. A whispering voice rasped through the speaker. "You see me now." Vincent clutched his chest, his skin cold with terror. He had spent his life chasing the paranormal, but he had never encountered something that acknowledged him back. Then, a knock at the panic room door. Soft, rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. Vincent gripped the handle of his gun. He wasn't alone. And whatever was on the other side of that door didn't belong in this world. Knock, knock, knock. Vincent's fingers tightened around his gun. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the heavy steel door of the panic room. No one else was supposed to be in the house. And yet, the knocking continued. "You see me now." The whispered voice from the speaker echoed in his head. He glanced at the security monitor, but the feed was still nothing but static. He had no way of knowing what, or who, stood on the other side of that door. Then, his phone buzzed. A text message. It was from an unknown number. Vincent hesitated. Then read the message. "Open the door." His blood turned to ice. A new message popped up. "I know you're awake." His hand trembled. He could barely process what was happening. This wasn't just a painting. It was something alive. Something intelligent. And then, the knocking stopped. Silence. Vincent exhaled, his heartbeat still thundering in his ears. Maybe it was gone. Maybe. The lights in the panic room flickered. A slow, creaking sound filled the air. His gaze shot to the door. It was unlocking on its own. Vincent lunged forward, trying to stop the handle from turning, but it was too late. The door swung open, and standing in the doorway was a small, shadowy figure. The boy from the painting. He lifted his head, his hollow, black eyes staring straight into Vincent's soul. And then, he smiled. Vincent's breath caught in his throat. The boy from the painting stood in the open doorway, his black, empty eyes unblinking. His skin was a sickly pale, almost translucent, and he wore the same tattered clothes from the cursed artwork. Then, he took a step forward. Vincent staggered backward, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the gun at his waist. But his fingers felt numb, unresponsive, as if something unseen was gripping him in place. "Don't be afraid." The voice wasn't spoken aloud. It crawled inside his mind. The boy tilted his head, his lips parting slightly. A grin. "You see me now." Vincent's head pounded. His vision blurred, the room warping around him. The walls of the panic room stretched unnaturally, growing longer and darker, as if being pulled into an endless void. The security screens on the wall flickered back on. The painting was different. It no longer showed the eerie, abandoned house where Vincent had first seen it. Now, it was a perfect depiction of his panic room. And inside the painting, there he was, standing exactly where he was now. Except in the painting, he wasn't alone. The boy stood right behind him. Vincent's breath hitched. He spun around, but the child was gone. But something else had changed. The door was closed again. And when he tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. Vincent was trapped. And in the painting, his reflection turned to look at him. And smiled. Vincent slammed his fists against the door. "Let me out." The metal didn't budge. His panic room, designed to keep intruders out, was now his prison. His gaze snapped back to the security screen. The painting had changed again. It no longer showed him standing alone. The boy in the dark was there, his pale fingers resting on Vincent's shoulder, inside the painting. Vincent's skin crawled. He whirled around, but there was no one behind him. The air grew thick, suffocating. The dim emergency light flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. He felt something watching him, something just beyond the veil of the living. Then, the security monitor glitched. The painting inside the screen moved. Vincent froze. His painted self, the version of him trapped within the artwork, was turning its head. Slowly, deliberately, to look right at him. His painted self smiled. A slow, sinister grin that spread too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Vincent's chest heaved. His own reflection was grinning at him, but he wasn't smiling. Then, the painted version of him raised a hand and knocked 3 times on the inside of the painting. Knock, knock, knock. Vincent's blood ran cold, because the knocking didn't just come from the screen. It came from behind him. He turned, dreading what he'd see. And standing right there, just inches from his face, was himself. But not him. The painted version of him. And it was stepping forward. Vincent's lungs locked as his painted double stepped toward him. It looked exactly like him, but wrong. Its eyes were too black, too hollow, as if something ancient and hungry lurked inside. Its grin stretched too wide, splitting its cheeks like an open wound. Vincent scrambled backward, his hand slamming against the panic room door. "No," he whispered. "You're not real." The thing tilted its head, mocking him. "Not real," it repeated in his own voice. "But I'm here. And you." Its voice warped, dropping into something deep and unnatural. "You don't belong anymore." Vincent lunged for the emergency shut-off switch, but his hand passed straight through it. Cold horror flooded his veins. His fingers went to his chest, to his face. He couldn't feel himself. He spun to the security monitor. The painting had changed one last time. Now, inside the frame, stood a terrified Vincent. His real self, his body, still inside the panic room. And standing in his place, outside the painting, was the thing. The fake Vincent. It reached for the panic room door. Vincent pounded on the glass. "No. No, don't." Click. The door unlocked. Vincent's copy stepped out, walking away, now free. Vincent screamed. Nobody heard him. Because now, he was inside the painting. Trapped. Just like all the others before him. And when his house was auctioned off weeks later, a new buyer stood before the painting, admiring it, unaware. And behind the glass, Vincent's painted eyes followed them, waiting.